I teach in women's studies, and I teach pop culture, and I teach film studies. I think those are really important topics for gender and sexuality studies, because pop culture is the very way that we learn about the most basic stuff about gender and race and what we're supposed to look like and how we're supposed to talk. And I always tell my students, the first time they ever have a romantic situation or go on a date, where did you learn to talk that way and to make your moves? Not from your parents. That wasn't something your parents, you didn't want to hear about that from your parents. Instead, it was something you saw from Jennifer Aniston or Halle Berry. You know, it was not something you made up yourself. Our most basic ideas about what we're supposed to be as people come from pop culture. I think it's also a place where we really, we get big attitudes about sexuality, race. Well, think about the influence of Ellen DeGeneres in terms of sexuality in this country. We have the really amazing situation that a woman who is a butch lesbian is considered America's most beloved comedian. She's the queen of daytime television. How could that happen? I think on some level she is responsible for helping to shift attitudes about lesbianism. You know, I think of my old Aunt Ellie out in Iowa, who used to think that all lesbians go to hell. And she began to watch the Ellen show, and she really likes Ellen, and she's in a quandary because she doesn't want Ellen to go to hell. And so she doesn't say much about that anymore, because she's, you know, her objections have been silenced because of the warmth of this personality that she sees on TV. So I think we see things like this that actually influence attitudes, but I also think that we pick up things from pop culture. I'm doing a class right now on women in Hollywood cinema, and we're looking at the scarcity of the roles for women of color as stars. So I begin that class by asking, who gets to be glamorous in the whole history of Hollywood cinema? What bodies do we put out there as the glamorous bodies? And this tells us an awful lot about race in America. It tells us an awful lot about how we see or how we make invisible the bodies of black women. We're looking at Lupita right now, the woman who won the Academy Award, and everyone's very excited and hoping that she gets good parts. She won playing a slave in 12 Years a Slave, and it was, you know, a great part, and she was terrific, but still, she was playing a slave. And that's the same role that we saw Mammy get in Gone with the Wind back in 1939. So Hattie McDaniel won for playing a slave, you know, many years ago. We're hoping things change, because even in between there, the only woman of color who won an Academy Award won for playing a maid. And we also we took a look at Monsters Ball, the only film for which a woman of color has won for Best Actress. That's a very troubling movie. When my students watched that, we were incredibly disappointed. We said, this is it? You know, we waited 70 years for a woman of color to get a leading role in a movie, and what we got was something that was very limited. So what I'm saying is that pop culture teaches us a lot about attitudes. Our attitudes about things like race and gender show up in pop culture. At the same time, we can also see that pop culture can nudge attitudes. It can make things happen, sometimes in good ways. But, you know, the movie that we watched was Monsters Ball. She won the Academy Award for that. And of course that was very controversial, for one thing because she was so very sexualized in that. The other thing was that in terms of gender, it was a very troubling role. She's someone who ends up becoming the girlfriend of the man who executed her husband, her black husband. At the end of the movie, she's saying, I need someone to take care of me. It's the most traditional kind of female stereotype, someone who can't live on her own. And so we said, oh my gosh, you know, great that, you know, she was good in the part. She got the Academy Award for good reason. But good heavens, couldn't it have been a better role? So, you know, in terms of gender role, it was disappointing. Usually I do film studies, and my books have all been about women in film, and that's actually how I was trained. But what I was seeing was that women who were doing good comedy weren't doing movies. There are still very few movies where women have good comic parts and where they are not doing comedy romance so that at the end of the movie they're in a heterosexual couple. So traditionally, the place where we've seen women in movies that had good comic parts were women who had very good comic timing, and I'm thinking of everyone from Katharine Hepburn, Carol Lombard, the old days, through Julia Roberts and Cameron Diaz. These women they can portray good comedy. They're not writing the comedy themselves. They got the roles because they're very attractive. And so one of the things was, if you're pretty, and this is where I come into the topic of my book, if you're pretty and you have good comic timing, we can put you in a romantic comedy, and you're going to be in a kind of comedy that can be very popular because it's very safe. The woman can be very unruly, she could be very crazy, she could be very subversive, but at the end of the movie, what she wants is the guy. So that kind of comedy has been the most popular kind because it's the most traditional kind. I'm interested in the women who have been comedians, who have been writing their own work, who don't fit that role. So I'm thinking of everyone from Mae West through Lily Tomlin, Joan Rivers, Gilda Radner, people who were writing their own comedy and who were frequently actually making fun of the idea of prettiness. And you can begin with Mae West if you watch any old Mae West movies. Mae West picks up very quickly from her experience on Broadway that drag queens can do femininity as well as women. They can perform it, and they can do it very convincingly. And she realized, wow, if I imitate the drag queens, I can show how femininity is done, but I can also show that it's funny. That being taught how to walk in high heels or how to swing the hips, that all these things are things that aren't natural, but they're things that we can learn. They're performances. So her career was all about making fun of femininity and making fun of our ideas of what is pretty. And I'm seeing now that there's a real kind of tradition, a line that we see through people like Phyllis Diller, and Joan Rivers, who believed they had to be unattractive in order to do their comedy, to people like Tina Fey, who really kind of take on and challenge that idea of being the pretty woman as the woman who gets the good comic roles. So I'm thinking that when Tina Fey publishes her book Bossy Pants, the book cover is a picture of the woman in the traditional author role, and there she is, kind of looking at the camera. But the thing is, it's a woman as boss, and so it's Tina Fey's head, but it's on a man's body, and she has these big hairy forearms. And she's making fun of that idea of prettiness. The other main thing that I'm looking at in my book is that pretty almost always means white. In our culture, wow, it means white or light-skinned. So I'm thinking of someone like Halle Berry, who gets to be glamorous because she has Caucasian features and is very light-skinned. And of course, that's the reason why we're so interested in Lupita and wondering if Lupita will break the mold and be able to be cast in really good glamorous roles as a woman who's a very dark-skinned woman. So I'm looking at people like, say, Wanda Sykes and Margaret Cho, who very much are pushing the idea of, whoa, white people are looking, and white people are the ones making the judgments about what femininity should be. So the racial piece is very important in the book that I wrote. The stakes are very different. Mm-hmm. And usually when a woman in the entertainment business stands up in front of an audience, her role traditionally has been to be pretty. If she's up there on the stage, well, she's supposed to be looked at. Okay, what she looks like is supposed to be very important, and it's how she's judged. A guy can go on stage and does not have to do that. So think about the history of movies and men who could be comedians, but even men who could take a variety of roles, like Tom Hanks or Dustin Hoffman, Woody Allen, who could play funny but could also play romantic. What they look like didn't matter. Woody Allen is never ever going to be a romantic ideal, but it doesn't matter. He was funny, he was quick, he was witty, so we could get these really good roles. Women, however, in romantic comedy had to be very pretty. That was the main thing. When women go up on the stage to be stand-up comics, they're just being there and standing there and getting the attention of an audience on some level is a subversive act, because they're being judged, they're asking for what they say as opposed to what they look like. And so frequently you'll find women comics who just go in there and do here is what women are supposed to look like, and I am making fun of that. I'm going against that. So that's why you see people like Janine Garofalo. Have you ever seen her comedy? She's been doing feminist comedy for a long, long time. Who really is kind of standing up to that. In a different way, look at Lena Dunham doing Girls and saying, look, this body is not the body that usually shows up on the sitcom as someone who's, who's doing comedy. But I'm going to put forward that body, and it's been very controversial. Think how she's been criticized as someone who doesn't have an ideal body, who is not ashamed to have it on TV. Another example of that would be the Mindy Project. Once again, we have Mindy Kaling as a woman of color who does not look like the bodies that we usually see in sitcoms, and she claims a space on that show as someone who can be sexy, someone who can have a boyfriend, someone who can get the really good guy. And she's doing all that and saying, yeah, this body's not the body that you usually see. But I think the reason this is so interesting is that we're talking about this kind of bigger prejudice about what women are supposed to look like for the camera, for TV, for movies, for entertainment. And what women look like has always been more important than what men have looked like. For comedy, for a man to be funny looking, it's an advantage. That's where you get the Woody Allen, or you get the John Candy, or the Belushi, or give me some examples right now. I can never, how do you pronounce his name? Zach?
Galifianakis.
Yes, yes. Those are people who, if they were women, would have had a much harder time getting into show business. Seth Rogen and all the whole Rogen gang are funny-looking guys who have done very well in comedy. We're a long way from seeing that same kind of grouping of funny-looking women who are doing that. I love the movie Bridesmaids, but think about how almost all the women were very conventionally attractive. Now, I think it's also true that Melissa McCarthy really stole the show in a lot of ways, and is really kind of out there and doing some really interesting stuff. But for that movie to be made, I think they had to have central casting do a lot of very standardly attractive women. The failure to hire Rachel Dratch is an interesting story, because Tina Fey had been the head writer of Saturday Night Live, and you would think that would have some clout. But she was not able to have the clout to get her friend Rachel hired, because the network wanted a more traditionally glamorous woman in that role, and they got instead Jane Krakowski, who's hilarious, but Rachel Dratch would have been a very different kind of presence. So it's very ironic, because the entire series, 30 Rock, is about the awfulness of network television and the old boy politics of network television. And of course, Liz Lemon is the young feminist who's in there, who just doesn't have a chance against that old boy network. So the fact that this actually literally played out with the failure to hire Rachel Dratch really is sad and ironic.
Do you think that that role would have been any different had Rachel Dratch been in it? Or because it does sort of play on Jenna being traditionally pretty. I think
oh, sure. It went an entirely different way, because and the writers then were writing about a woman who's very vain about her looks, and I think they did a good job of making fun of that kind of aesthetic. And here's a woman whose only value is what she looks like, and I think the show does a real, the satire of that kind of very shallow value is done very, very well. But to have Rachel Dratch be there, I think she would have been a different kind of unruly woman, a different kind of unruly presence. And if you remember, the very first season, she had some guest roles. Remember, she was in a couple of those things. And she is very, very funny. But it was a different kind of show because of that hiring decision. In the history of comedy, if you look at the history of comedy, one of the things that stand-up comedians have always relied on is what they call the dick joke. The whole history of stand-up comedy, to say the history of dick jokes, and by naming it this, you're saying this is a male discourse. It's a male tradition. Women, of course, cannot do this because we can't talk about our bodies. So the fact that she is willing to do that, I think, says something about her politics. I mean, the other thing is that she does some very funny skits there, like the Oh Nutters skit. Have you ever seen that? What they do is it's available on YouTube. It's certainly worth looking at. They go to a bar that's supposed to be like Hooters, except that men are the ones who are the waiters, and these are men who are wearing very tight, skimpy little things, and they have to dance on the bar when the women want them to dance on the bar. It's a really good example of how the switch off, the role switch off, is hilarious, but it also is a very pointed feminist comedy about how women's bodies are kind of taken for granted as fair game for that kind of humiliation, and it's just considered part of culture. If you look at women who have been interviewed and women who are willing to talk about it, they say that of course it's hard because you get booed off the stage sometime, The heckling sometimes is very personal, kind of sexualized heckling. And the problem is that with stand-up, there's a tradition of heckling. To have smart Alex in the audience is part of what stand-up can be about. And so frequently with women, the heckling is specifically sexual. I think it's much tougher in every way. The judgments on women are harder, and also there really is still a bias about women doing it at all. A couple weeks ago I was at a conference. These are scholars, people who were very smart people, and there was a woman who was in the audience who said, well, she said, I don't think we're ready to accept women as comedians because women are supposed to be nurturing. She said, women are mothers, and this is the role that we want to see, and if you're a comedian, you're not playing that nurturing role. People stared at her. It's a really kind of outrageous thing to say. But this was a very educated woman who really believes that a woman should not be a stand-up comedian, shouldn't be funny, because it goes against female nature, which is to nurture. And of course, stand-up comedy is aggressive. It's very aggressive. It has to be out there. It's very frequently raunchy. It's authoritative. Lily Tomlin has an interesting quotation where she says, to make somebody laugh is a powerful thing. She says, you take over that microphone, you're in charge, okay? You're making someone laugh. It's a dominant position. And she said it's the reason why there were so few women doing it, up through, oh my gosh, up through the 1980s, early 90s, really very, very few. I think the stats now are still weighted very heavily in terms of men. It might be maybe 20%, maybe for a long time it was only 5%. Have you heard any stats?
I haven't. No.
It's still, most, turn on the Comedy Channel, and what you're going to see are mostly guys. Look at comedy films, and you're going to see the Seth Rogen group doing a lot of comedy. And then if you see Melissa McCarthy, it's, oh my gosh, wow, a woman's doing a comic film. How unusual. So, anytime women go into a film, into a situation or take on a role that's not considered feminine, there's going to be flack. Yeah, it's going to be difficult to do. Television comedy has long had a whole history of very strong, wonderful women writers who were behind the scenes, and they didn't show up, and it was a safe place for them to be, right? Because it was low profile. People didn't realize that it was women's comedy that we were seeing. But the history of television is very much a place where women could be as long as they knew their place and they were behind, not in front of the camera but behind the camera.
It's interesting that you say they didn't realize it, because one of the sketches that you talk about in your book, the Hillary Clinton, Sarah Palin sketch, we sort of get this feminist comedy and we're not even realizing.
Right, yeah, and I love Tina Fey's comment. What we're talking about here is the sketch where Tina Fey and Amy Poehler impersonate Hillary and Palin. And they're supposedly, they're both complaining about sexism in the media from very different kinds of things. And in her book, Tina Fey says, this was a feminist sketch, and you can tell she's really proud of it. She really, gives us the whole thing. She goes through pages and pages of it. And she said, yeah, this was feminism. She said, it's like putting spinach in the broccoli. You didn't realize it was good for you. But I like that idea that feminist comedy is good for you. And I think that's a really important point. It's the main reason why I wrote this book and why I was so interested in this. Laughter is bonding. Comedy is bonding. It's the reason why sexist jokes, racist jokes, homophobic jokes are so dangerous. It's because they bond people together. You're at a party and somebody tells one of those jokes that you're not supposed to laugh at. You're going to be pressured into laughing because you want to be part of the crowd. And also it's that bonding device of, oh, it's us against those people, whatever group that happens to be. So if you find yourself instead laughing with women about some awful thing that's sexist out there, that's a bonding device. It's making things happen. Today in my class, I just taught Thelma and Louise. That is a very funny movie. There's a lot of comedy in that movie, and people don't think about it as a comic movie because the ending is, sort of sad, although it, it has some uplifting moments in it. But to watch that movie, as one critic says, you end up having to laugh at some of the men because the men are so hilarious. You know, the cop and the truck driver and the husband are very funny. But to laugh at them means to take on a female position of saying, wow, this is what patriarchy is about. It is laughable. There's some stuff out there that you can just laugh at. That's a powerful thing. And it's the reason why I think we have to pay attention to pop culture. It's the reason why we have to pay attention to what's happening with comedy these days and women's comedy. There is power involved.
Mm-hmm.